it just seems to me that what we're experiencing with the Trump regime is actually an attack on liberal counterinsurgency. And I just think that it's, I think we just need to think about it that way, right? So like, you know, like if we think about, for instance, USAID, right, which is established in right? I mean, let's be real. I mean, it's established in 1961 by JFK, which I think is the same year that he starts to use the term counterinsurgency, right? And it was developed to stem the tide of communism across the third world, right? And in the first instance, we, you know, like Western imperialism is largely responsible for creating the political and economic conditions that then need to be ameliorated through aid, right? So via, you know, regime change, structural adjustment, XYZ, you create these conditions and then you provide the aid. You know, with conditions, of course, right? Conditional aid, and is designed to promote dependency and to dissuade militant forms of intervention. You know, the idea of aid as a weapon is perfectly encapsulated by the horrifying image of the aid literally crushing people in Gaza, killing I think 5 children, right? I mean, that's the emblem of aid as a weapon, right? So this isn't to say that aid is bad, obviously, right? But it's a weapon, right? And this is like the same dynamic that I lay out in Tip of the Spear on a much smaller scale in terms of how prison reform and the use of the dispensation of privileges is then used as a weapon that can be withdrawn, right? So this is the dynamic, right? You know, and
which
we can think of like
said in South Africa, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's Dan Mitrone. People might remember Dan Mitrione. Dan Mitrione was a CIA operative who was teaching people torture techniques in Uruguay in order to defeat the Tupamaros, a revolutionary movement in Uruguay. He was kidnapped by the Tupamaros, and they were trying to develop a prisoner exchange program, and it didn't happen, and they executed him, right? He was kidnapped in July of 1970, by the way, a few days before Jonathan Jackson's raid on the Marin County Courthouse, a few days before the Long Attica Revolt starts. And this is why later Nelson Rockefeller makes the connection between the tactics that are being used in Latin America, where he had economic interests and a whole intelligence gathering apparatus in Latin America and Attica and New York, where he was governor, right? Because these things were happening at the same time and they were using the same tactics. Mitrione's cover as a CIA in Uruguay was USAID. He was a USAID officer. Similar to the guy I talked about, I think the first time I was on this program, what's his name? Donald Bordenkircher, who developed counterinsurgency tactics in California prisons and in Vietnam and in Abu Ghraib. Worked with the FBI and the CIA. He was in Vietnam under USAID. So this isn't to say USAID is all bad or that everything USAID does is bad, but it's a liberal counterinsurgency apparatus that was developed to help bolster consent and investment, right? And so that's what's under attack. That apparatus is under attack from the hard right. I mean, DEI is under attack. DEI is liberal counterinsurgency. We know this, right? We know that it's used by the ruling class to stabilize imperial power by assimilating marginalized groups into positions of relative authority in the hopes that their ascendance will obscure the conditions of naked violence or even encourage people to want to advance within that structure and like become an overseer, right? So DEI has always come under fire from the left. And we've always critiqued it as liberal counterinsurgency. It's really similar to like the indirect rule, the system of indirect rule by like the British Empire and others. The Department of Education, that's liberal counterinsurgency. I mean, we've known that since at least Carter G. Woodson, right? I mean, right? The education system is a site of political struggle. We know that. When you can control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. That's Carter G. Woodson. That's a quote, right?
The schoolhouse was meant to replace the stability lost with the demise of the plantation.
There it is.
Donald Spivey.
There it is. You know, any socially conscious Black person with a child in public school understands that at some level, the education system is structured as anti-Black counterinsurgency. I mean, the work that me and my wife have to do with my child, my 13-year-old, when he comes home from school is intense. So we've always recognized that it was a site of struggle. So these things that are actually weapons against us, but that are weapons that incorporate aspects of consensual and hegemonic power, inducement, right? That don't rely on naked violence. Those are the things that are under attack because we are now subject to a regime that is so confident in its ability to dominate that it feels that it doesn't need to manufacture consent in the same way, that it can just rely on naked violence and repression and fear. And so I think that's kind of where we are.
So what do you think that this is? What do you think this will mean then? Do you think that there will be some conflict among the ruling elite who want to say we like our liberal counterinsurgency tactics? Do you think that there will also be a sort of attendant decline in the political consciousness of our communities and audiences who are going to be sort of, you know, roped back in by being encouraged to re-engage the fight to protect the liberal counterinsurgent efforts? What do you think?
Yeah,
Because
no, I mean,
since you texted me that, I told you I need to let that marinate, and I did. I had to let sit with that for a minute and drive around and think about that. Like,
no, obviously, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think there's definitely going to be. I mean, the fights are already happening. That's why Trump has installed all these loyalists who will do his bidding. I mean, there are people who are dissenting, right? The question is, you know, the issue is that obviously we on the left haven't been able to build the capacity to meet our own needs outside of these structures, right? So they did provide a terrain of struggle. And this is why I've been really happy that you've been talking about Stuart Hall lately, because Hall is like a premier interpreter of Antonio Gramsci and this idea, you know, this idea of a war of position, right? So like the Department of Education is a site of a war of position, right? It's a terrain of struggle that's abstracted from the actual, you know, it's abstracted from the actual moment or the actual goal of actually seizing control of the state. But it's a terrain of struggle where we can fight over, you know, creating spaces for doing, you know, because obviously there's lots of teachers and school administrators who are doing amazing work within the Department of Education, right? And so I think the opportunities for that kind of struggle are being narrowed. And so it's going to force us to think really seriously about the need to develop independent alternatives, because these spaces are going to be much less hospitable to that kind of work. It was tolerated before in some cases, and I think it will be less so.
Man. And then 4 years from now, we're going to be being told, get your representation back by voting for.
Yeah.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.